Hello and welcome to episode 8 of Airs for Architecture with me, Ambrose Gillick. In this conversation, I speak with Erika Doss, Professor of American Studies at the University of Notre Dame. We discussed her book Memorial Mania, Public Feeling in America, published by the University of Chicago Press all the way back in 2010.
I think a lot of the memorials themselves are built because of the abandonment of rituals and the abandonment of ceremonies surrounding death and bereavement in the nation as a whole. I mean, Americans, they do not share common grief patterns or, burial understandings or even what to do with a body anymore. So the memorials, in a sense, are absolute replacements in the larger public sphere for that.
Airs for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome again to Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Professor Erika Doss. Erika, would you introduce yourself, please?
I'd be happy to. I am a professor of American Studies in the Department of American Studies at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. And as an American Studies professor, I focus on issues and themes relevant to American cultural studies in particular. I'm trained as an art historian, and I actually have a fairly wide-ranging sort of interest, if you will, in a variety of subjects. So I have written books, for example, on 20th century American modern artists such as Thomas Hart Benton. I've written articles on Edward Hopper, but I've also written a lot on public art, and in particular, contemporary and modern public art. And I continue to do so. I'm working on a new project titled Monuments Are Mortal, which is basically an exploration of
the life cycle. Could you repeat that? That you broke up a little bit. Monuments? Sure.
Monuments Are Mortal. Which focuses on the life cycle or lifespan of public art and among other things, architectural space, etc. I'm really contesting the assumption that so many have that once things are in the public sphere, they're supposedly permanent or fixed, but that's simply not true for a variety of reasons, from environmental conditions to political and cultural conditions. And that's what this book is about, the new book.
That sounds brilliant. And when's that coming out?
When am I going to finish it is the question.
That's a very unfair question, isn't it? I mean, you've probably got an editor breathing down.
It's getting there. It's almost there. So,
and that's involved. So what we're talking about today, and the reason why I wanted to speak to you, and perhaps we can hack into that straight away, is your book that you published in 2010 with University of Chicago Press called Memorial Mania, Public Feeling in America. And I was sent links to a number of books, University of Chicago Press authors, and sort of like kid in a candy store, take your pick kind of thing. And I saw your book and it put me in mind, and I put this in the questions or comments I sent to you beforehand, of another book that I've used previously in my teaching by Sharon McDonald called Memory Lands, which is, so I'm very interested in the concept of memorialization and the spatiality of memorialization in contemporary culture. I think there's something fascinating going on, both in the way that we do it and also in its absence in our everyday lives, compared with previous epochs, previous periods in our history, where perhaps we've been better at memorializing things in an everyday kind of way. So that's kind of where I'm interested in. And I've been thinking over the course of COVID that the public trauma of COVID was inevitably going to lead to discussions around memorialization, if not of death, then of the traumatic quality of the whole condition, the whole social, economic, cultural condition. So that's kind of where I came to it. So I was kind of really interested in this book, and obviously, perhaps we can start by you telling us a little bit about where this book came from in 2010, and perhaps where you've got to with it.
Sure. So I began writing and publishing on public artists in the 1980s, and I was sort of doing so as a critic or an historian, talking about new kinds of public art. But I was particularly interested in new kinds of public art that were historically engaged. For example, projects by an artist named Andrew Lester, who was a British artist who came to the United States and did a lot of projects focusing on the recovery of mining histories and mining and miners, and why he did that, and what he was about, and what he was sort of interested in. And then I realized that this wasn't just about his art and his practice, it was about this engagement with the public. In other words, why were particular publics interested in having their histories, particularly their labor histories, sort of commemorated or remembered in public art form? Mm-hmm. So I started my work in public art by talking about artists who were historically engaged in representing, and not in book form, but in public art form. And then what was interesting about so many of these projects was how quickly they were forgotten or were abandoned by their very publics. In other words, many of Andrew Lester's projects are no longer exist. And so I was fascinated by this sort of failure, to maintain, or this failure to sort of sustain an interest in these commemorative projects. Mm-hmm. He took it very well. I think I would have been far more devastated by creating something and then having it literally abandoned and sort of let it go to waste.
And what were these things like? Were these big metal concrete?
No, in fact, he did one in Frostburg, Maryland, on the campus of a university there, State University, that was a miners' memorial. It was called Prospect 8. And a prospect or a prospector, I mean, these were all terms that were used to talk about coal mining. And he did these projects in the 70s and in the 80s when coal mining in this country was undergoing sort of a significant decline, particularly deep coal mining or deep seam coal mining. Everything has switched over now to strip mining. So what he was doing, in a sense, was recovering miner history. And they were only too glad to tell their stories and share their folk tales and sing their songs and contribute all this stuff that went into sort of these museum-like public art spaces. But then, because they themselves abandoned the region and moved on to better economic opportunities, these spaces didn't survive. And so that sort of, to bring us up to what I'm working on now, I've become really interested in, all right, what is the lifespan of a particular work of public art? But back to these earlier projects. So my interest in public art is really motivated by the historical stories it tells, or the people it commemorates. And in that sense, as an art historian, I'm fascinated by any kind of public response to art. I mean, there's so many other things to be preoccupied by and to worry about and be anxious about. So I've always been fascinated by public response, and particularly public response to the built environment or to the proposed environment or the proposed sculpture, et cetera. So if anything, my work has really been a sort of a chart of public response, public ideas, public debates, public arguments over perceptions about what is representing the public in the public sphere. And I'm fascinated then by sort of the democratic historical engagement with art, with the built environment. So Memorial Mania came about because I kept writing these pieces on controversy, public controversy over this public art or that public art. And one day I was thinking, yeah, it's like a mania. And then I realized, ooh, that's sexy. Memorial Mania, great title. And the problem with a great title is I had to make a book to fit it. And so that's what I did. And so I started by saying, what the hell do you mean by mania? And I'm in American Studies, and I was at an American Studies Association annual meeting, and I listened to a very good session on affect, on feelings, on emotional behavior. And I realized, this will be very helpful. So instead of just telling stories about particular memorial controversies and public response, let's tell stories. Let's write a book that will be divided up into chapters pertaining to the particular emotional responses that people have regarding public art. And I began to group them. And I grouped them according to a lot of negative emotions. We would say anger, fear, maybe even grief are negative emotions, but also positive emotions. Gratitude is one of them. And that's how I divided the book up. So again, this was a book driven by a title in which I then needed to investigate, well, what does that title mean?
Mm-hmm.
And then I sort of fit understandings and arguments about public response to and the public making of public art into these particular chapters. I'm a case-driven historian. I really like writing about a single work and sort of the big picture story surrounding that. But then I bring in lots and lots of other examples to sort of exemplify what it is that it stands for. So the case studies in Memorial Mania are grief, gratitude, anger, shame, and there's one more, which I can't remember.
It is fear.
Thank you. And it was good for me to do this because I learned a lot doing this project, which is why we write books in the first place, about these particular affective conditions and how they shape political expectations and political participation. I mean, it seems to me we've been living in fear in the United States of America as an affective condition for decades now. Mm-hmm. And so how does that play out in terms of the spaces we live in and the kind of art forms we prefer and just how we talk to one another? And in a sense, Memorial Mania is a book guided by those ideas. But as I was writing this book, I also realized, wow, you are really presenting some negative history here. Is there the possibility that emotions could actually be powerful enough to transcend these expectations of doom and gloom or loss, as you mentioned? And so I wanted to end each chapter with, what is the transformative potential of anger, fear, shame, gratitude? Can these emotions be used, and can public art that is made sort of conditioned by these emotions, can it actually affect political and cultural change? So I tried to end each chapter with, well, I know I've set you up for 45 pages here about the problematic conditions of this emotion, but here's an example of how that emotion was utilized in the public art world for better, for the goodwill of the public, for human flourishing. Yeah. Because I really do feel that as an author and a teacher, one of my responsibilities is to try to provide hopefulness and ways that people can imagine their ways out of this sort of boxed in feeling of negative emotions.
Yeah. Well, that's an amazingly rich telling of the story of the book. And I say this a lot, but this is a beautifully written book. And I mean, that's to be expected. You're a professor, as I would call it, Notre Dame, as you would call it, Notre Dame.
Oh, no, we call it Notre Dame. So we are Americans.
Well, you can call it whatever you like. But I was interested in what you were saying earlier about the way that you have started off engaging with this historical thing. Because I was thinking, when you started speaking about the artist, and the name I forget.
Andrew Lester.
Andrew Lester. That you were going to talk about how his practice was about enabling the telling of grassroots or ordinary voices, normal voices, which is a kind of very postmodern, very dominant thing in postmodern thing. But instead you flip that around, and I quite like that, this idea of actually exploring how people respond to art and to events as you look at in Memorial Mania, and how the public's politic in a way is shaped by that. And then the effect, as you say at the end of the chapters, looking at the way that these things then go on to potentially be used in positive ways, or could be used in positive ways. So I thought it was a really, because we do have that tendency now. I think we're all a little bit, what's the word? Catastrophize everything, don't we? And it's kind of fun to do it. So there is a really lovely and elevating tone to the book. But I wanted to start by asking you about this. So this idea so I read the book, and then I was looking through it again before we started to speak. And the idea that jumped out at me that was quite strong was this issue around who's telling whose history within these memorials. Because you tell stories of both institutionally mandated or mediated histories being presented through memorials. And the one I picked out in my notes to you, but it's a good story, is the one about the Onyati memorial, and which is, I mean, maybe you can talk about that. And then there's also the ones that are about grief that you pick out in the chapter on grief, which are spontaneous representations of public emotion, which I suppose later on then become consolidated into a public memorial. So seems to me to be these two kind of two types of history being told through this, and that the book is about this tension and this toing and froing between them. Is that fair?
That's fair. There are a remarkable number of sources for public art origination.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there is, as you mentioned, institutional public art, which we would call the Washington Monument, or the Lincoln Memorial, or the Jefferson Memorial, et cetera, anything along the National Mall in Washington, D.C. And then we have smaller grassroots public art projects that, they sort of grow up on the fringes of suburbs, particularly in America today, as war memorials, as suburban America sort of spreads out, and folks who were in World War II are almost all gone, but the Korean War have a lot of time on their hands, and they also have a lot of income on their hands. And so they are very engaged right now in making, and have been for the last several decades, war memorials. I mean, you cannot go anywhere in this country without stumbling on a veterans memorial of some type that it's been erected in the last 20 years or so.
By who erects?
Okay, so almost every city has an arts commission, or public arts commission sometimes, and then you might come to them with a proposal and say, we've got a new playing field or a new rec center or a new suburban development going up. I'd like to propose that we make a war memorial or a veterans memorial, and they'll talk about it within that city council, and they will or will not give approval. That's generally how these things work. And then there will be fundraising. There might be some public donations, there might be private. That's public art. There's also public art that's made on private spaces that then becomes publicly visible, but they don't typically involve a city council or a local commission. So, I mean, there are a lot of ways to get engaged in this way of making sort of a public statement about whatever historical cause or historical event you want to remember. A better example might even be the 9/11 memorials that were built very quickly and are almost continued, but almost gone now in terms of the being built. I think there are well over 1,000 that were built in the United States, right? But this is now 21 years ago. And it's interesting talking with my students here at the university about 9/11 memorials. They weren't even born when 9/11 occurred. So for them, this assumption on the part of 9/11 memory makers that this was the event that was going to set up the 21st century, they don't share that at all.
No.
And so these memorials are, they're not completely irrelevant, but they're not that relevant to them. But there are a lot of them. I mean, there's the big ones, such as the National 9/11 Memorial, September 11 Memorial in New York. And then there are these little memorials all over the country. Back to my point. So how did they get made? a lot of people following 9/11 drove to New York, with flatbed trucks and went to the sites of the demolished World Trade Center towers and got a hold of pieces of the mangled steel and then drove them back to their hometowns and sort of used that as the fodder for the beginning of a particular 9/11 memorial. Sometimes they just sort of placed it there and put some bricks around it, and it became a 9/11 memorial with a plaque. But this happened all over the country. It probably was pretty difficult for city councils to say, you can't do that. Don't take up that space on that fire station lawn or wherever, because it was such a moment, an event. So sometimes these things happen more spontaneously than what I'm actually describing in terms of city council involvement and public approval. But if your question is, how does public art get made? It gets made through a person or a group wanting to commemorate, and then figuring out where and how and when to do so. And there are so many ways of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't just about money. It definitely, though, is about what I call public buy-in or public support. Because if you don't also at the same time sort of create a public ownership of your public art, then it's liable to be abandoned or vandalized.
Mm.
And if that's what you want, that's fine. But if you want something to actually have public claimants who will take care of it and will find it meaningful, then you as the maker or the commissioning agency have to do some work in terms of involving them.
It's quite an interesting idea, isn't it, that you get this grassroots movement, and that's a very kind of powerful image of these people coming across the United States almost in a peculiar way, in a pilgrimage, to collect the relic, to bring it home, and then have to work in a coordinated, co-productive way, a symbiotic way, to generate the cultural capital and the social capital, political capital, to sustain this thing, even whilst, in a way, the memory disintegrates, or the memory gets buried under later traumas. So, for example, the military adventurism that came after it, which
exactly,
in a way, a bigger trauma.
9/11 memorials are absolutely, as you say, buried within a sort of understanding of what happened very quickly, which was, military assertiveness. And I'm not sure that that's exactly how people had, wanted this to happen. But I actually see the getting in the flatbed truck and driving to New York as a way of processing grief for a lot of people. And I understand that, get in the car and drive. And particularly if folks were coming from California, driving to New York and going across the country, because, almost immediately the New York Times and other newspapers called 9/11 an attack on America. So as Americans felt very attacked, the way that so many responded was, I'm going to go get some of that attack and I'm going to bring it back to my space, and I'm going to commemorate those who died, but I'm also going to sort of create this space for vengeance or some sort of assertiveness. I mean, these are not delicate memorials.
No.
These are big in many cases, and they're violated, they're aggressive, it's metal, and again, this was just a way that people sort of worked it out. It's interesting because I'm also interested in the idea of reuse and the way in which people took ruins. And New York invited people to come and get this stuff off their hands. I mean, they were swamped in terms of what are we going to do with all this rubble as they're sifting through the remains for bodies and body parts and, trying to keep track of the dead. So they were happy to give stuff away. Take this 25-foot long piece of steel and go make something in Louisiana or Texas or wherever. It also helped spread the mythology of 9/11 as an attack on America. This story as it was writ large.
But that's a really interesting point. And I did want to come to that point a little bit later, but maybe we can do it now, which is that you get this grassroots movement that then gets appropriated by political narrative, which is, as you say, the New York Times, which is, center-left newspaper, calls it an attack on America in a way, in using language that, well, prefigured Donald Trump in many ways. And I find that really fascinating, this idea that whose memory are we talking about here? Who has rights to the memory? And it comes back to your initial introduction around the early work you did around public art. Whose memory are we talking about?
And whose story is being told?
Yeah.
I remember thinking initially, so 9/11 was preceded by the bombing in Oklahoma City. And I remember sitting with my husband on the evening of 9/11 after the events had occurred. And almost immediately TV reporters were talking about the memorialization that would no doubt occur. And I was shocked. I mean, this event was still, it was hours old.
Yeah.
And I turned to him and I said, I'll tell you one thing. They're not going to be, and at that time, the numbers for the World Trade Center were in the thousands, multiple thousands. And I said, they're not going to build a park with 10,000 chairs, which is what they did at the Oklahoma City Memorial, where 168 people died. And, almost immediately people were fathoming memorial and commemoration. They hadn't even found bodies yet or recognized.
Why do you think this is? This is the first question I wrote to you. And what is this turn towards memory about? And as I put in my notes to you, if modernity is characterized by much, it's characterized by a kind of progressive idea of itself, of futurity, of going forward and looking to the future. And yet we've got this really strong drive now,
yes,
memorialization, which with the 9/11, or even perhaps, dare I say it, the Oklahoma City bombing, as terrible as they were, kind of exceed. I mean, in Britain, we have one for Lady Diana, Diana, Princess of Wales, which kind of exceeds even the scale of what occurred.
Of the event. Okay, so I think it comes out of a lot of places. French historians and scholars like Pierre Nora, writing about memory and memory studies in the 70s and 80s, they talk about it in terms of rupture. All right. So there's been some sort of psychological or intellectual or historical rupture in a nation state like France, which Nora explained was, we'd come to the ends of modern industrialization, and what happened to the peasants? So we decided to recover the history, the memory of the 17th and 18th century peasants. Okay, well, that's not what's going on in the United States, obviously. But we have the same sort of historical ruptures. I'd say the biggest rupture has been the memory of, the history of, and the lack of shared understanding regarding the Vietnam War. And then shifts and changes in terms of American identity, the decline of the middle class, supposedly, so much separation in terms of class and economics. I mean, there have been all these historical ruptures, not necessarily precise events and days, but these sort of conditions. So as a result, people, I think, have turned to memory practices like let's commemorate as a way to stop time and make sense of the history, even though we don't share any particular precise understanding of what the history is, but literally to stop time and go, okay, and if we commemorate it now, maybe we can freeze those events into some sort of commemorative project. All right, but that also relates to the fact that I think that Americans are terrified of forgetting or being called people who forget for all of the associated reasons, including the decline of the human body and Alzheimer's and dementia and all of that. So this shift to memory is, and I find it very difficult to separate memory and history, although there are some who do so relatively easily, is also, as I write in the book, about experience and participation and sort of my ownership or my claiming of sort of the course of events. I think we have shifted to memory and memorialization as a way to say, this is how I understand events, and this is how I'm going to remember them forever. And that, in a sense, is impossible, because what you're making now is not going to last forever. So
it's like a first love, isn't it? You think, I will never forget my first love, and you do.
And you do. Yeah. Right.
But I think that's a really interesting idea. So this differential between history and memory, which I've read about as being sort of a shift from a kind of hierarchical idea of what the past was constituted of and meant, to a more subjective and interpretive and personal, a kind of, again, a postmodern term. And I don't know if that stands up, and I don't know if that's robust within the literature, but that's certainly something that I've read. And it sort of makes sense to me. And it makes sense in a way of memorialization, which, as I understand it, is and certainly in some of these temporary, ephemeral memorials that you write about, seems to be a way of making holy memories, so that, like sacred spaces work for people of religious persuasion or spiritual persuasion, these memorials are in a way a secular version, a way of creating axial points around which public behavior can be orientated and organized. So when you go to the memorial, you put on a somber face, you fold your arms across you don't wear short skirts, you don't, wear a grab back t-shirt. You know what I mean? There becomes a kind of a series of almost like a liturgy of expected behaviors around these things. You see stories in newspapers still about people getting arrested for, in a way, desecrating war memorials by doing things like getting drunk against them or copulating against them, as if they were sacred.
Right.
Which I find kind of really interesting as well.
I think a lot of the memorials themselves are built because of the abandonment of rituals and the abandonment of ceremonies surrounding death and bereavement in the nation as a whole. Americans they do not share common grief patterns or burial understandings or even what to do with a body anymore. So the memorials, in a sense, are absolute replacements in the larger public sphere for that. Now, whether or not people treat them with the same due respect as a cemetery or a burial or a funeral, that it really differs. I know I've been to the September 11 Memorial in New York several times, and I'm always sort of amazed at how people are sitting on the memorial or putting their there's 7-Eleven coffees on the memorial, changing diapers on the memorial. And I'm like, yeah, okay, this is how people are, but this is supposed to be a sacred space. And mind you, it's built on top of the space where people died. Thousands of people died. So do we even understand what it is that we're doing in these spaces? No. And that they put up little signs saying this is they don't say sacred, but they say this is, behave yourself. What does that mean? So
do you think people know what they're doing when they make these memorials, particularly these temporary ones? Do you think, you write again about the Columbine high school shooting, and the kids went and put flowers and pictures on the victims' cars in the parking lot in the car park at the school. I do wonder about and Lady Diana, again, her memorial, after she dies in the car crash in 98. I'm sorry, I forget.
96.
Was it 97?
Yeah.
It can't have been 96, because Tony Blair was elected in 97, and he was like, he utilized that for political gain. But anyway, there was just this kind of thing happened. Flowers in front of Clarence House. Vast mountains of flowers.
August 31, 1997.
1990. Thank you very much. Thank you, Internet. Do you think people know what they're doing, or do you think people are behaving in slightly uninterrogated ways, or is and therefore is the role of what the state or the institutional power does is it kind of works to articulate that grief in a way that is universalizing. So it becomes it, and to do that, it makes very banal memorials.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
go on.
as I write in that chapter, I was particularly intrigued by the amount of material and the patterns of sort of ritual and the expectation that if somebody died in sort of horrible circumstances, school shootings, car accidents, that these temporary or spontaneous memorials would be erected at the site of death, which I also find very interesting.
Yeah.
And everybody seemed to know the ritual practices involved, which have become more and more elaborate. And so these are the new social expectations. And what a terrible thing if something happens and a memorial isn't built. I mean, what does that say about that person or that culture? So do they know what they're doing? They may not be able to explain it, but the very act of doing it suggests that they take it seriously. And they participate in what they perceive as an important ritual. They go out of their way to do it. It takes up part of their day. And then people, may return to it to grieve or to mourn or to add to that particular temporary or spontaneous memorial project. What I was interested in is, where are you getting these ideas from? Who's driving this sort of material culture ethos of grief, and why these things, not those things, or and what are you saying? And ultimately, what I concluded was, it's fine to do this, but I also think that the real problem here is how folks die. This does not resolve the problem of gun violence. Making a memorial to gun violence victims simply alerts us all to the fact that there are a lot of gun violence victims.
Yeah.
It doesn't reckon with the problem of gun violence.
Yeah.
And that I don't think most people want to, I don't think most people are engaged in that kind of thinking. So it is an immediate sort of response to create a temporary memorial, and where it goes.
This is really interesting. So this is, I would love, you're an art historian. There's an aesthetic quality to everything that we're talking about. Have you identified, I mean, in terms of the more permanent, so there's a kind of a spectrum of memorials, temporariness, isn't there?
Yes.
From the from the vigil, there's always a vigil.
Right.
And there's always a certain type of candle. So there's a candlelit vigil. And then there's often enough a pin, a badge associated with it. There's often enough, and then there's kind of things that are done by the state which fit within that. So there's this kind of spontaneous, but this is all in a series of, I suppose, aesthetic practices. Have you noticed the spectrum of like dependable so the 9/11 memorials made out of twisted steel from the World Trade Center, did they take on a certain form? Well, Vietnam memorials of a certain kind, have we, can we kind of spot and age the type? Is there a typology to these things?
Yeah. Well, and that question too is there any connection between the look, the aesthetic, the emotion of the temporary memorial with the permanent? And there is and there isn't. That the interesting thing about the temporary memorial is this is really where the public responds and contributes and participates and experiences. Then when it gets turned into the permanent memorial, well, you've got a commission, right? You've got 12 people sitting on a panel picking out a particular form. And they're going to be guided not by the experiential, participatory, broadly public giving of the temporary memorial. They're going to be guided by other factors. They're going to be guided by money. They're going to be guided by media, material, place, etc. So, but the big thing that'll guide them too is, 12,000 people turned out for that memorial, so we better build a permanent memorial to sort of celebrate the fact that, or commemorate the fact that this has deep public meaning. So, sometimes it builds off on that. Is there an established sort of style or aesthetic for some of these memorials? Yes. The 9/11 memorials that have the piece of steel are typically accompanied as well by a plaque, with names. Naming is the big practice.
Yeah.
So many war memorials just in the last couple of decades, let's say the last 40 decades, consist of, essentially metal or granite or rock slabs right out of sort of a graveyard or a cemetery culture. There isn't a lot of innovation, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And so, minimalism as a style is the preferred memorial style for so many memorials, like war memorials to a degree, but there's also the continuation of a figurative tradition with some war memorials, and a figurative tradition with, as you mentioned, the Oñate Memorial in New Mexico, the representation or the celebration of a particular historical figure from the past.
Yeah.
So I mean, to be really frank, I don't see a lot of innovation in public art, the kind of art we're talking about right now. I do see some innovation in new kinds of temporary public art. But that's different, particularly people who are looking at augmented reality or working with new media. But that's a whole different sort of approach.
But those kinds of memorials often that we've talked about are related to tragedy or to loss. There is the other kind of public memorial, which the Oñate one in New Mexico is a really good example of. Well, it's a really good example of a lot of things, but that are related to protest and dissent, where you get, and it's not a very sharp distinction as I read it, people challenging, using a memorial to challenge social, political, economic condition. So, for example, there was one recently in London during the lockdowns, so 2020, I suppose, which was for a woman who had been kidnapped and murdered by a policeman, and a horrific event. And the spontaneous memorial that occurred in central London was interrupted by the police being policemen, really. And it was both a memorial and a protest, because it was very specifically a women's only event, because it was about women's safety. So I found that quite interesting. This idea of perhaps innovation occurring in spaces where memorialization is more linked to challenges to structural violence in some way.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we certainly saw that during the protest of the Black Lives Matter movement, where people were constructing alternative memorials and having protests surrounding, for example, Confederate monuments or Columbus monuments.
Deconstructing memorials almost as an act of constructing.
Yeah, or constructing a new kind of way of thinking about or rejecting the memorial forms of the past. But the Oñate Memorial was certainly, it's a statue of a Spanish conquistador that was put up in Alcalde, on the outsides of exterior of Alcalde, New Mexico, and then was vandalized with a foot being cut off. And then when the foot was put back on a few years later, another foot was painted red. And eventually the statue was removed, again, following the murder of George Floyd and the protests in the summer of 2020. So it becomes this sort of focal point of protest regarding representation, politics, who gets to be represented. Most importantly, what's the historical message being projected from this particular representation? And that statue originally stood facing a highway, so that it was totally noticeable as people drove up and down that highway as to who was being celebrated in New Mexico and who wasn't. And so for Native Americans who saw that statue, the glorification of a man who conquered native tribes in the late 16th century and tortured native warriors was absolutely oppressive and offensive and could not be tolerated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we've got this kind of idea that I think that the memorial might become something different. The one that I mentioned in my notes to you was Edwin Lutyens' cenotaph, which is to the unnamed soldier, and it's where the royals and the prime minister and the marching and all of the stuff happens on the 11th of the 11th every year. And it's really interesting because in every town and village in the country, I was in a town near here doing some research, community outreach work recently, and they had their war memorial, and it was built quite clearly not on public land, but on church land. And I think that's true, that the war memorials in Britain are now managed by arm's length organization, War Memorials Commission, I think it is. But I don't think that they were the work of the state. I don't think the state wanted to recognize its intrinsic guilt in the First and Second World Wars, that they put their sons and daughters to death for the
no states
for various reasons.
That no.
And it's really interesting. But this one, it was a very small town at the time. In 1910, I looked at it. It was just a few streets, but it lost about 240 young men to. I think it was probably about 400 houses. This 400 or 500 houses. It lost 200. They were just working class. You could just feed them into the machine. And this was in one war. That was in the First World War. And yet, it's got all their names on it. And you go to London, where the king and the queen and the prime minister salute it and lay their wreath. There's no names. There's no recognition of the subjective. There is a definitive curation of the memorial. And more to the point, the architecture itself is entirely abstract. The design is this sort of slightly staggered, slightly Egyptinal Victorian piece of, very beautiful. And I think the corners are supposed to meet 1 mile above the surface of the earth. So what? Clever, right. But meaningless, literally meaningless. So I was really interested. Yeah, but you can look at someone like Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial, likewise. Purposefully not meaning anything. Or Peter Eisenman's Memorial to Murdered Jews of Europe. And I'm kind of fascinated by that aesthetic as well. Why are they doing that? When the state or when powerful organizations get involved, why do they produce this aesthetic?
So the thing about the Maya Lin Memorial, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, dedicated in '82 in Washington, is that the commissioning agents, in the number one rule was she had to list the names. Mm-hmm. All right. So, the World War II Memorial, which was dedicated in Washington in 2004, does not. So it has stars. It has stars for every, 1,000 soldiers who were killed in the war. It's a very different kind of memorial because the thing about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and that was commissioned by a separate group, a veterans organization that was angry that they had not been honored or commemorated in the form of a parade or it wasn't like coming home from World War II.
No.
And so they put this project together. It took a long time, but they got the permission of the federal government. They got the place to put it. They got Maya Lin, big controversy over all of that. And she created this memorial, which has been...
Because she was just a student at the time, wasn't she?
She was a 22-year-old at Yale University. Yeah, it's an amazing story. I love sharing the story with my students to say, this is, aspirational here. And she came up with this dream of a design. And today, she wouldn't get anywhere because the whole public art industry is so professionalized. Yeah. But in any case, this is the most significant memorial to be built in the last 50 years, incredibly influential because of those names.
Yeah.
Now, the names are not just on a wall, they're also on a highly reflective black granite surface, so that when I walk past it, I see myself reflected in the name. So you've got that participatory, experiential aspect of the memorial, which is very important. It's also low to the ground, so I can reach over and touch. And, you can walk back and forth. People do. And it doesn't have to mean anything. Or, I mean, it's been very rare that I go to that memorial that I don't see someone grieve or be grief stricken by that space. So recognizing that, lots of people have glommed onto that style in a variety of memorials, certainly including the murdered Jews of Europe, a memorial in Berlin, and so many others. But it has to do with names. And back to your comments about the memorial in London without names, because that was made that way because there was the assumption that you participated in a war that was about the nation state and you're all sort of part of the citizenry. That's not good enough anymore. No. People want their names and they want to be able to be both the member of the nation state, but also the individual. And in a memorial like the one you're describing, it's not surprising that people feel alienated from it, because they are alienated from it. I mean, you're the unknown, you're the big mass, instead of you're the individual that's part of this big thing called the nation state. That's what makes the Vietnam Veterans Memorial successful. And it's what makes the National World War II Memorial, nearby the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, not successful. It's big, it's grandiose, it covers several acres, but I watch people go in and out of it over a minute or two. And they simply do not have the same kind of emotional attachment to that memorial space that people do with perhaps not even understanding why with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial.
It's really interesting. And it's a sort of, effectively creating something that sits both in the kind of monumental, monolithic quality of a memorial, which therefore has the kind of heft to be claimed by the state, and also with this very intimate and subjective, personal, in a way quite normal. It looks like gravestones, which is quite clever. It looks like, it's like a wall,
right?
A gravestone that's been extended. So it's what we think of when we think of death. And that's that's a very clever play. I mean, what a designer. I know we haven't got much longer, but I did want to ask you about this idea of memorialization as almost as a kind of an instrument of urban cultural consumption. Like you can now go on a Passchendaele tour as a tourist. People, and I don't say this lightly, but people seem to go to places like Auschwitz.
So we're talking about dark tourism.
But also even in lighter tourism, where you've now got even lighter memorials are being used increasingly as ways of kind of organizing not only the spaces of cities and towns, but also the urban regeneration strategies. You said earlier, 12 people sit down and they say, well, we've got this much money and we can do, but they also say, how can we place this such that we can get 12,000 people turning up every year?
Right.
And therefore, where does the coffee shop go?
There are fierce debates too with people, for example, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a recent memorial museum and sort of a project has been ongoing for a while, but a recent memorial museum opened about the 1921 Tulsa, what was called Wall Street massacre. And what this was a white supremacist retaliation in a Black business district, and hundreds of people were killed. And now, a century later, there has been the memorialization of this event. There are bricks in the sidewalk, there are murals, there are several statues, and there's now a memorial museum. But there is this tension between city council saying, how much horror from our past can we really tolerate in our present? And is this the history that'll take us into the future? And we're at this moment where we are recovering a lot of the horror shows of American history. And we're turning them into exactly this, these sort of memorial sites to visit. And why are we doing this? It's not just about income. It's not just about, generating tourist revenue. It's also about a city making the decision to say, we're reckoning with our past. So I think that there's this sort of behavior that, okay, it didn't just happen. We have to think about why it happened and understand and assess why it happened, with the caveat that we don't want it to happen again, or we have to make sure that history doesn't repeat itself in quite this way. So it's complicated. There's a revisionist historical program in which history that has long been buried or ignored or even denied is being recovered, and it's being turned into, it's not a book, it's not just a TV show, but it's actually a physical, experiential place that you and I can visit.
Yeah.
And then what? It sort of leaves it open. And I see in so many of these spaces, the Oklahoma City National Memorial, this new memorial in Tulsa, rooms at sort of the end of the museums where they say, now, what would you do? Or what should our future be? And they sort of open it up to these dialogues amongst their audiences. And I think that's kind of refreshing. So at least people are maybe caught going, well, what would I do? What would I have done? Could I have prevented? Or what would I do now?
Isn't there something difficult in that, though, insofar as it puts people, so to come back to this kind of normative style of memorialization, people don't know what to do with the memory. So they then feel, so you're sort of asking people a question at which they're kind of intuitively aware that they will fail. So they come up with something perhaps banal. Let's put a name on it. Let's make a t-shirt. Let's record a personal history, rather than, I don't mean that in a kind of pejorative sense, but like, isn't the job of processing memory the job of historians? Isn't what historians do is they tell a story that we accept?
Yeah, there's a moralizing aspect to this. I mean, it's not simply that historians want to make sure that we know the history so we don't repeat the mistakes, but there's definitely, I mean, to go back to what we were talking about earlier about what are the known practices? Do we all share these practices? No. So there's the sense in which these institutions, museums, memorials, commemorating agencies, are trying in a sense to affect a kind of moralizing space where people will ask themselves the question and maybe, consider the possible answers. I find this fascinating. I mean, it is perhaps secular, but it's coming right out of, an ethical approach to historical facts and historical futures. And, it's not simply like this happened, move it on down the road. No, this happened and it's really up to you. And I think that's a good thing. I think that people need to be constantly reminded of these things that happen, ask themselves why, and then go to the next step, which is, okay, what can I do to make sure this doesn't happen again, et cetera. It's very different from a dark tourist approach of going to Auschwitz or going to one of the camps and just, posing for a picture. This isn't just about posing for a picture.
No. There's an aestheticization, I think, which is quite interesting in this as well, that we are, I mean, part of that aestheticizing process is something to do with creating nodal points where memory is contained. Otherwise, we're haunted. And I think this is Sharon McDonald, but I think other people have said this, so that these bad memories haunt every aspect of our lives. I was talking to a therapist during COVID who said it was very interesting doing therapy online, because what people did normally when they went to their therapists is they went to their therapists and then they would unload trauma issues in this space and then they would walk away from it. And all of a sudden people were unpacking trauma at home. So they were sort of letting the ghosts out at home, and then they had to live with it.
Yeah,
and I
or
suppose
share it.
Memorialization is about creating very distinct, bounded spaces, like physical spaces, where we dump trauma and then we walk away.
But maybe we walk away with a little bit better understanding how to actually work with the trauma. Get away from that fake sense of, oh, I'm closed off. I've come to closure. There's no closure on grief or trauma, but there are better ways of dealing with trauma, ways of managing and maybe sharing that. Memorial spaces, public memorial spaces allow you to share grief. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been at a memorial and talked with people there and shared, why are you here? What's your story? They become very sociable spaces. So the idea of what you're talking about with that therapeutic presence at home, if you're living with other people, then maybe you share, the outcome of that therapeutic moment with them. It makes it public, maybe. It keeps it from being so privatized that it just stays too self-contained. So I agree. I think, memorials play important roles in American society by providing those kinds of spaces. But then they also become problematic for that because some of them are going to be superficial or false or inauthentic spaces. So that it really becomes up to the public to make them into meaningful and productive public spaces for whatever affect or emotional energy they want to try to sort out.
How long do they last? That's the word. Go back to at the very beginning. You talked
Monuments are mortal.
Temporariness.
It's such a good question.
How long do we have to have? There's two questions there, isn't there? How long should we have them, or how long do we have to have them, and how long do we have them? Do they die off before they're any good? Before they've done all of their work? Do they disappear?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, memorials are presentist. Memorials are made by me today for me, and they're consumed by you today. Okay. That's simply a fact. We are driven by our historical interest and our political interest today. And I mean, it may take decades to get a particular war memorial made, but that means that war is still of significance to those makers at that particular time. They almost start to lose their publics immediately. So much of one of the big reasons I wanted to write Memorial Mania is I was sort of astonished by people thinking that if I finish the memorial, the problem goes away and I'm done commemorating, right? That to make a memorial was a way of saying, did my duty, due diligence on memory, and now I can move on to something else. And I thought, well, that's very callous, but it's also very calculated and contained. How long do they last? They last as long as publics use them and feel like that they are usable. So once they become unusable or untenable or oppressive, which is certainly the case of Confederate monuments, Columbus monuments, we can name many others, then they start to come into contestation, debate, argument, and they may be vandalized and destroyed, removed, taken down, dumped into ruined gardens of lost memorials, whatever. But there's no particular time frame. There's no forever, and I think that's a really important story to tell, and that's the story I want to tell now, which is they have a lifespan. And that lifespan depends on environmental factors, acid rain, air pollution. We got to widen the road, all sorts of factors of space, but also audience. So
I quite like this idea that actually what they do is they generate a forgetting. Because one of the things that you said, you didn't mention there, but you mentioned earlier was this idea that, like 9/11 memorials, ultimately, they've been forgotten. Some of them. You've got the big one in New York. You've got your central one in the center of power.
Yeah, they haven't been entirely forgotten.
So they're about an articulation of a memory so that that enables a forgetting. Does that say that?
And nobody's going to admit that. That's a lot of money. It's $1 billion for a forget memorial, which is what September 11 memorial eventually ended up costing. But I don't know if the word is forgetting, but it certainly is completing. And, in a sense, that's what a funeral and a burial are about as well.
Yeah.
The life cycle comes to an end. We have done the rituals of remembrance, and now, we can go on. It's not that easy, and it never actually works that way.
Yeah.
People remember.
Yeah. Thank you, Erika. That was really wonderful. I thank you so much for coming and talking to me.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Wasn't that good? Timely too. Thank you to Erika for joining me and for her erudition. The book's great, so buy it. See the podcast description for links to that, to Erika's professional profile, and a great lecture she gave in 2010 for the Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design entitled Public Art, Public Feelings, Creativity and Controversy in Public Culture Today. And please like, subscribe, follow and share A is for Architecture, liberally. Cheers.